I'm going to talk about brain. Brain is in charge. Brain assigns responsibility to other brain actions, meaning it holds other brains responsible. The better our actions, the more interaction brain gets. Keep other brains responsible for their actions. Keeps brain, unconstrained volition, clean. And then those outside sources are gathered by our senses, and our senses make way to our perception. That perception gives way to our intellect, and that intellect gives way to the myriad, the witness of myriad of those wonderful alternatives. And brain concludes that some alternatives will not hurt brain, but make it more knowledgeable. This brain likes. The concept of good and the concept of bad don't really exist. As per the Jiminy Cricket example, let your conscience be your guide. What does that mean? So because brain computes what alternative will give brain the best possible effect, the best possible outcome. Because the best possible effect will enhance fitness. Because it's all about that. So the concept of good and bad don't really exist. So the concept of good will versus the bad will don't really exist. No good or bad volition, just brain being a biological automaton seeking the best possible outcome.
The choice is, I think, an illusion. By the time you think about, well, do I want to eat a peanut butter sandwich or a tuna fish sandwich? It's really already predetermined by the subconscious. There is no external actor that's mulling over one alternative versus another. You being a spectator and not the actual, well, decider. My brain being a mechanism of my subconscious that's programmed by past experiences and knowledge and all of that, thinks that the use of the word you to refer to another brain's consciousness is flawed consciousness. Because the consciousness is again, it's merely spectating your subconscious, that the will is a manifestation of the subconscious and not the conscious brain. Initially there's this comment about okay, personal responsibility in society. Just because we hold someone accountable for their actions in society doesn't really matter, and it certainly doesn't prove freedom. And I'd like to reference the rabid dog example. Education and deterrence work, and that's all part of this determinism, and it's part of the, again, like Gary said, the swirling mess that's actually clockwork. And then what I want to finish on here is this about the there's no good and bad will, and we know all that's important is to listen to the conscience, and what the Jiminy Cricket, in other words, type of story. And so when Jiminy Cricket says listen to your conscience, what he's saying is listen to your empathic subconscious, and there's no alternative to listening to your subconscious. I mean, what he was really saying is listen to empathy, or I guess accentuate or reprioritize empathy, because suffering sucks. And I agree with that message, and I think that supports the existence of, yes, there is, like, you can say actions are good or bad.
You don't choose where you're born, you don't choose who your parents are, you don't choose your genetic code, you don't choose your early experiences which set the ball of causation in motion. I mean, those things are going to be sort of hard to dispute. You're just thrown into the world, and all these little experiences, millions and millions of seconds, create a mosaic, and that mosaic is what your character is, what your personality is, what are the dominant patterns that you run, and what are the less dominant patterns. There is no me, there is no you, there is no we, there are just brains running programs, more or less dominant programs, and sometimes the programs are both really competitive with each other. A dominant pattern could be interrupted by a less dominant pattern, and it could cause you to stop and think that you are making a conscious choice. But in actuality, it just is subconscious.
Yeah, I think we've come to a lot of agreement for most of us. And the basic idea would be is that, yeah, there's nature and there's nurture, and that constructs basically a disposition inside you, a brain full of programs, concepts, ideas, principles, directives. Some of them are prime directives, some are lesser directives, and that were just basically constructed by our life experience, and this becomes a reflex of sorts, and we express that reflex as what we call a personality or an identity. But that identity is mechanical in its origin, not anything else, and there is nothing besides those programs running inside our brain. That a good will is the more difficult will. I guess the simplest way to put it is lots of ways to do something wrong and fewer ways to do something right. The fact that our brain does seem to create a contest. There's this, for every action, it seems that it searches for the contrary, a reason not to do it. That it actually looks for it and creates a contest whether one exists or not. And I would almost argue that's sort of like this nature to be inhibited, to be a little bit risk aware, if not risk averse, and that we have to overcome that inhibition in whatever the activity is. It does slow us down enough to say, are we certain or are we uncertain? And that's sort of what I would say is part of this hierarchy. There are reliable concepts in our brain and less reliable concepts, ones that we have more doubt about, and those stimulate this inhibition and this time the brain takes. It actually takes time. You sit there sometimes and say, I don't quite know what to do, and your brain works on it, and you wait for it to come up with an answer. Say somebody can play the piano very well, and they show up to your house and they just bang on the keys. You could say, okay, I'm going to judge them for that because, hell, I know they can do a lot better than that. That's way underperforming. And so we could make arguments about behaviors that are thoughtless, are reckless, are sloppy, are unwell reasoned, where somebody just had to basically say, where they had to think so outside the acceptable box. Like somehow, when people go out in the street and they, bash a woman over the head with a brick and steal her money and rape her, what have they had? What did they have to do to their brain to get to the point where they could find any kind of justification for that? And those things seem so overtly selfish or so overtly nonsensical that would be a standard where we'd say, that's just too effed up. That's just not right. It's not sensible, and it seems, all the words would fit. Lazy, sloppy, reckless, that's just not good enough. A computer that's that broken, that's that lazy, if you had a computer that lazy, you'd say it's not worth buying. It's not worth plugging in. It's not worth feeding it electricity. Game. You have to have a certain level of competence to play the game, I guess is the point.
And neuroscience may prove that 80% plus of our actions are determined for sure, but there is a hint of transcendence that can break the deterministic universe. Mr. Monk guy that lit himself on fire is a perfect example of someone that can transcend the deterministic universe. Now we take your normal Joe Schmo Schlo whatever guy, and he touches a stove. His hand is immediately repulsed. But Mr. Monk guy lit himself on fire and didn't even budge. So the deterministic, yes, but there's also a hint of human will.
But I can respond to the idea of a monk being able to desensitize himself or remove himself from his senses by setting himself on fire or whatever he's doing, walking on hot coal or whatever. To me, this is just a disciplined practice that takes years and years of meditation and mindfulness or whatever. And yeah, it's something that a child, if they touch a hot stove or something, they're not going to have the ability not to react right away if they haven't had the training to withstand that amount of pain. Look at the brain, and how the brain works is that different events make impressions on the surface of our brain. And over time, those impressions become deeper and deeper until they work into our system of patterns, of programs, and those programs can become so deep, the impressions, that is, can become so deep over time that the patterns are habitual and we don't even think about them. Certainly you feel as if you are free. So many things depend on the forces of other individuals, other brains, other things, and even those things there are restrictions and limitations which prevent those things from being chaotic or sporadic or doing anything outside of the laws of thermodynamics or gravity. So that's the thing, and everything that's coming out of my mouth right now, I just press play on this, and I don't think about what's going to come out. It just comes out, and I don't even I'm not even thinking about why I'm thinking about this. So you always have to question what is the antecedent before the thinking about the thing, if that makes any sense. And I know it gets kind of weird.
Summing things up so far, I don't think we've heard or could find any good rational arguments that the human brain functions outside of cause and effect. We are what we're made to be. We're byproducts of the world that we live in. You could just go back through history and say, why wasn't a human being 100,000 years ago actualized free will individual who could just make himself a spaceship and fly to the moon? And he wasn't, because he didn't have the capacity to be that yet. He hadn't learned how to be a modern man. And we learn how to be the people we are. It's that simple, through exposure. Like a plant growing, you need good soil, water, and sunlight. Human beings also need to be fed. And the garden of human beings, it needs feeding and it needs weeding. If you want good people, then you got to have good ideals, you got to have good ideas, and that's it. And you got to make them grow. You got to make them substantial in people. You got to make them what the plant grows for. But yeah, you're going to do that with conversation. You're going to do that with actions. Whether you help or hurt, whether you give people carrots or you give them sticks. All this stuff is going to decide what we are, how we behave. And yeah, we're all feeding off of each other. We're all action and reaction. And that's the function in our society, and it's the function inside of our brains. And that's pretty much all she wrote. We are witnesses to ourselves, and we are not the controller. There is no controller beyond the controlling understanding, the controlling skills, the controlling competence, the controlling understanding, the controlling intelligence, the controlling ideas. That's all there are. And so let's promote good ideas and such. So anyway, till the next round and such.